In the fall of 1967, a United States Navy Chief Petty Officer named John Anthony Walker, Jr. walked into the Soviet Embassy on 16th Street in Washington, D.C., and offered to sell classified American cryptographic material to the Soviet Union. He was 30 years old, a communications specialist who had spent 12 years building a Navy career that his own superiors in their efficiency reports had described as exemplary. He was also at that moment deeply in debt, a financial hole traced in Pete Early's later book-length account of the case, and in subsequent biographical retrospectives drawing on it, to a bar he had opened and lost money on while stationed aboard the submarine USS Andrew Jackson in Charleston, South Carolina. What Walker started that day would not be fully unraveled by American investigators for nearly 17 years. By the time it was, he would have recruited his own son, his own brother, and one of his closest Navy friends into an espionage network that a subsequent director of naval intelligence would describe as one of the most damaging security breaches in the history of the United States Armed Forces, one that compromised, according to FBI estimates, more than 1 million classified and top-secret naval messages. The operation would end not through a counterintelligence breakthrough, but through the actions of Walker's own ex-wife and daughter, set in motion by a custody dispute that had nothing to do with espionage at all. This is the story of the Walker spy ring, the ordinary Navy career it grew out of, the family relationships it exploited and ultimately destroyed, and the 17 years it took for any of it to come to light. If you're drawn to the hidden human stories behind Cold War intelligence operations, subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover a new documented case like this every week. John Anthony Walker, Jr. was born in Washington, D.C. on July 28, 1937, the middle son of a father who worked as an advertising manager for Warner Brothers and an Italian-American mother. According to multiple biographical accounts, his father's alcoholism eventually led to the family's bankruptcy, and the Walkers relocated to Scranton, Pennsylvania, to be closer to relatives who could help support them. Walker attended Catholic school in Scranton and, by his own later account, worked a string of odd jobs as a teenager, a paper route, door-to-door sales, ushering at a movie theater, before dropping out of high school during his junior year. In May 1955, Walker and a friend committed a series of burglaries, netting little more than a few tires, some car accessories, and a small amount of cash. He was arrested and, according to accounts corroborated by his own family, given a choice by the court between military service and jail. He enlisted in the Navy in 1955 at 18 years old. Whatever trouble had marked his adolescence, Walker thrived in the structure of military life. He trained as a radio man, served aboard a destroyer escort and later the aircraft carrier USS Forrestal, and by the early 1960s had been selected for advanced training in cryptographic equipment, the systems the Navy used to encode and decode its most sensitive communications, including submarine movement orders. His submarine service included participation in surveillance missions off the Soviet port of Vladivostok, and he was present with the fleet observing the July 1962 Starfish Prime high-altitude nuclear test. He qualified to maintain cryptographic gear in early 1963 and was assigned to the Blue Crew of the Polaris, ballistic missile submarine USS Andrew Jackson, then under construction at Mare Island Naval Shipyard. He impressed his executive officer enough that when that officer was later named to command the Gold Crew of another Polaris submarine, the USS Simon Bolivar, he brought Walker along to run the boat's radio room. Over these years, Walker rose from petty officer to chief petty officer to chief warrant officer, a career arc his own commanding officers rated highly in fitness reports that praised his technical skill and evident enthusiasm for the work. In 1957, while on shore leave in Boston, Walker met Barbara Crowley. They married soon afterward and eventually had 4 children, 3 daughters and a son. The family moved frequently with Walker's postings, eventually settling, for a period in the 1970s near Norfolk, Virginia, home to one of the Navy's largest concentrations of communications and submarine facilities. It was during an earlier posting, aboard the nuclear ballistic missile submarine USS Andrew Jackson, homeported in Charleston, South Carolina, that Walker made a decision that would prove financially catastrophic. He opened a bar as a side business. It failed to turn a profit and left him, according to Early's account and the biographical record built on it, in serious debt at almost exactly the same period he had risen to a position with access to some of the Navy's most closely guarded cryptographic secrets. According to the most detailed reconstruction of the case, journalist Pete Early's account in Family of Spies, built on trial transcripts, wiretap conversations, and interviews with Walker, his family, and Whitworth, along with a 1986 interview Early conducted with Solomatin himself in Moscow, later published in the Washington Post. Walker drove to Washington in the fall of 1967 and walked, unannounced, into the Soviet embassy. He offered classified material, a list of key settings for a Navy cipher machine. In return, according to that reconstruction, he negotiated a standing arrangement that would eventually pay him between $500 and $1,000 a week. The KGB officer who handled Walker's initial approach was Boris Solomatin, who was later promoted to deputy chief of the KGB's Foreign Intelligence Directorate and awarded the Order of the Red Banner specifically for recruiting Walker. Within a month of Walker's embassy visit, according to Solomatin's account to Early, Walker met a Soviet contact outside a department store in Northern Virginia and handed over a larger set of Navy documents, receiving in exchange the locations of his first dead drops and additional payment. That meeting, per the same account, was one of only a handful of face-to-face contacts the KGB ever risked with Walker over the following decade. The rest of the operation ran through an impersonal system of dead drops and signal sites designed to minimize any direct contact between Walker and his handlers. Oleg Kalugin, another senior KGB officer who later managed aspects of the Walker relationship, would eventually describe it in an interview given years after the Cold War ended as by far the most spectacular spy case he had personally handled in the United States. For the first several years, Walker operated alone, using his own continuing access to cryptographic material as a working Navy communications specialist. In 1968, the KGB's 16th Directorate, the signals intelligence counterpart to the American National Security Agency, took over handling of the case from the foreign intelligence officers who had originally recruited him, a reflection of how seriously Soviet intelligence had come to regard the material Walker was providing. Only a small number of KGB officers were ever read into the operation. Walker's material was funneled through a single channel to the deputy chief of the KGB's Foreign Intelligence Directorate, with just a couple of assistants aware of the source, an arrangement designed to protect what had quickly become one of the KGB's most productive American assets against exposure from within its own ranks. The context in which Walker began operating was, by any measure, one of the most tense periods of the Cold War's naval rivalry. American and Soviet submarine forces shadowed each other constantly, and the cryptographic systems Walker had access to governed communications tied directly to nuclear deterrence and fleet movement. The exact kind of material a rival superpower would value most and an adversary would work hardest to protect. It was against this backdrop that Walker's decision to walk into an embassy with a cipher key list represented not a minor leak, but a direct compromise of the systems meant to keep the naval balance of power secret. Walker retired from the Navy in 1976 after 20 years of service, having reached the rank of Chief Warrant Officer. His retirement created an immediate problem for the operation he had built. Without active duty access to current cryptographic material, his value to the KGB depended on finding other ways to keep the pipeline of classified information open. He solved this problem over the following years by recruiting people who trusted him. The first recruit was Jerry Alfred Whitworth, a Navy radio man and longtime friend of Walker's, whom he had served alongside for years. Whitworth had enlisted separately from Walker, training as a storekeeper before converting to radio man training at Bainbridge, Maryland in 1965 and going on to serve aboard a communications relay ship handling a large share of the classified message traffic moving between fleet units and shore commands during the Vietnam era. By the time Walker approached him, Whitworth held exactly the kind of continuing access to sensitive Navy communications material that Walker, now retired, could no longer reach on his own. According to federal prosecutors, Whitworth began providing material to Walker sometime between 1974 and 1975, continuing until his own retirement from the Navy in 1983. Whitworth would later testify that Walker had told him the material was destined for Israel, or for other American allies, or even for the naval reference publication Jane's Fighting Ships. Anything, according to Whitworth's own trial testimony, except the truth. Prosecutors estimated Whitworth received approximately $332,000 for material he provided between 1974 and 1983. The second recruit was Walker's own older brother, Arthur James Walker, a retired Navy lieutenant commander. Arthur had retired from the Navy in 1973 after 20 years of service, and in 1975 had gone into a business venture with his brother John that ultimately failed by the end of 1979, leaving both men with significant debts. According to court records from Arthur's later appeal, John told him in January 1980 that he had friends who would pay for classified defense information. And Arthur understood, according to the same records, that those friends were Soviet intelligence. John encouraged his brother to find a job with access to sensitive material, and on February 25, 1980, Arthur Walker took a position as an engineer with VSE Corporation, a defense contractor in Chesapeake, Virginia, that did classified engineering, planning, and technical work for the Navy, including projects related to marine architecture and missile and spacecraft engineering. The position required a secret-level clearance, which Arthur held without apparent difficulty. He would later admit to providing his brother with documents and photographs relating to naval vessel design. The final and, according to the government's later damage assessment, most operationally significant recruit was Walker's own son, Michael Lance Walker. Michael enlisted in the Navy and was eventually assigned as a seaman aboard the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz, a posting that gave him access to a substantial volume of classified material passing through the ship's operations and communication spaces, as well as material from Oceana Naval Air Station in Virginia Beach, where he had also served. Michael would later admit to providing his father with stacks of classified documents from both postings. Material investigators would eventually recover in quantities weighing many pounds. John Walker also approached his daughter, Laura Walker Snyder, who was serving as a secure communications operator with the U.S. Army at Fort Polk, Louisiana, asking her to provide Army secrets and codes. Laura refused, and according to her own later account to the FBI, never provided any material, a decision that would later place her in the unusual position of being the one member of the family both approached for espionage and instrumental in exposing it. By the early 1980s, the Operation John Walker had begun alone in 1967, had become a four-person network spanning three branches of a single extended family and one lifelong friendship, a father, his brother, his son, and a friend he had served alongside for decades, all funneling material through Walker to Soviet intelligence. What allowed the Walker network to continue for as long as it did was not any single failure of American counterintelligence, but a broader pattern of institutional blind spots later documented in press and government accounts of the case. Personnel who left active duty, like Walker himself after 1976, and like his brother Arthur, who had retired in 1973, fell into a category of significantly reduced security scrutiny even when their prior access made them obvious candidates for continued monitoring. According to contemporaneous reporting on the case, both John and Arthur Walker held top-secret clearances throughout their Navy careers, yet were never subjected to the periodic reviews those clearances were supposed to require. There were, in the years before the case finally broke, at least two moments when the operation might plausibly have been exposed through more conventional means. In 1984, Jerry Whitworth, evidently wrestling with the position he had put himself in, and facing his own approaching retirement from active involvement, anonymously mailed a series of letters to the FBI's San Francisco field office between May and August of that year, signing them only as RUS, and confessing, in general terms, to his role in an espionage operation. He asked for immunity from prosecution in exchange for full cooperation. The FBI and the Department of Justice declined to negotiate immunity through anonymous correspondence, and after several exchanges, the letters stopped. Whitworth's letters, whatever they might eventually have led to, were soon overtaken by an entirely separate and unrelated chain of events, one that began not with any intelligence failure but with a phone call from Walker's own ex-wife. John and Barbara Walker's marriage ended in the mid-1970s after nearly 2 decades together. Barbara would later testify that she had suspected her husband of espionage as far back as 1967 or 1968, the earliest years of his involvement, and had even told their children in general terms that their father was not, in her words, a good person, though she stopped short at the time of using the word spy. She would also later testify that Walker had struck her when she confronted him directly about her suspicions in 1968, and that she was struck roughly half a dozen more times over the years before the marriage ended. For years, Barbara did nothing with what she suspected. She would later tell reporters that she had started to contact authorities on at least 4 separate occasions and had been unable, each time, to follow through. After the divorce, she moved to Skowhegan, Maine, working at a local shoe factory and, by her own account and that of friends she made there, struggling with alcohol during the years she carried the secret alone. One friend from that period would later recall a Barbara Walker asking her, during a January 1984 visit, to do a tarot card reading to help her decide whether to finally go to the authorities, a decision Barbara was still turning over nearly 10 months before she actually made the call. What finally moved her to act in the fall of 1984 had little to do with espionage and everything to do with her daughter. Laura Walker Snyder had separated from her husband, Philip Mark Snyder. In 1982, Snyder retained custody of their young son, Christopher, and, according to Laura's own later account, threatened to expose her father's espionage if she pursued legal custody of the boy. On November 23, 1984, Barbara's 47th birthday, Laura called her mother and, in an emotional conversation about the pain of being separated from her son, pushed her mother to finally act. According to Laura's later account, she called her mother the following day and learned that Barbara had gone to the FBI. Barbara Walker's initial contact had actually come 6 days earlier. On November 17, 1984, she phoned the FBI's Boston field office and told an agent that her ex-husband had been selling secrets to the Soviets, naming both Arthur Walker and, with a slightly garbled pronunciation, Jerry Whitworth as accomplices. The report that resulted from that call was, by later FBI admission, mishandled, filed away, rather than escalated, in part, according to subsequent accounts, because Barbara had been drinking during the interview, and her account, though detailed, initially struck the agent, who took it as difficult to credit. A follow-up call from Laura in January 1985, asking why nothing seemed to have happened, was similarly logged and set aside. It was not until a routine 3-month file review in February 1985 that a Boston field agent noticed Barbara's original report and forwarded it to Washington and to the Norfolk field office, where John Walker was living. With the case finally escalated, FBI agents interviewed Laura Walker Snyder directly. On March 7, 1985, she confirmed to investigators that her father had asked her to provide classified Army material and that she had refused. 2 FBI agents working the case, Paul Culligan and Charles Wagner, spent several subsequent meetings, building her confidence, and on March 25, 1985, with a recorder set up in her apartment in Buffalo, New York, Laura placed a call to her father, a man she had not spoken with in 3 years. He did not recognize her voice at first. The call lasted 55 minutes. Its contents remained classified, though agents later described it as providing crucial corroboration of the family's involvement. Culligan would later tell reporters that Christopher, Laura's son, had been the key to the entire breakthrough, that without the custody fight motivating her, her willingness to help would likely never have materialized, since patriotism, in his assessment, had played essentially no part in her decision. Around the same period, Barbara Walker gave investigators a second, far more detailed interview in which she described accompanying her husband to Washington area locations used to clear dead drop and signal sites, and recalled her husband once recovering $35,000 from a single drop, a sum so large that investigators initially found it difficult to credit. With corroboration in hand, the FBI placed John Walker under close surveillance in the spring of 1985. Agents tracked his movements as he conducted what investigators recognized as a dead drop in a rural area of Montgomery County, Maryland, leaving a package of classified material near a roadside marker. In the early morning hours of May 20th, 1985, FBI agents arrested Walker at a motel in Rockville, Maryland, hours after he had made the drop. Walker was later quoted of his general attitude toward any classified material he could reach, as having said that if he had access to it, consider it gone, a boast consistent with the casual disregard for classification he had maintained for nearly 2 decades. A search of Walker's home and records following his arrest quickly implicated the rest of the network. Michael Walker was arrested aboard the USS Nimitz, then in port in Haifa, Israel, on May 22, 1985, with roughly 15 pounds of classified documents found hidden beneath his bunk. Arthur Walker was interrogated over several days and voluntarily testified before a federal grand jury in Baltimore before being arrested at his home in Virginia Beach on May 29, 1985. Jerry Whitworth, whose earlier anonymous letters had never led anywhere, was arrested on June 3, 1985. Each of the 4 men's cases proceeded differently through the federal court system, reflecting differences in their culpability, their willingness to cooperate, and the strength of the evidence against each of them. Arthur Walker chose to go to trial rather than plead guilty, believing, according to later accounts, that his extensive cooperation with investigators, he had given FBI agents some 35 hours of interviews and testified voluntarily before the grand jury, would be rewarded with leniency. He was convicted in federal court in Norfolk on August 9, 1985, of 7 counts of espionage-related offenses. On November 12, 1985, he was sentenced to life in prison and fined $250,000, a result his own attorney would later describe as reflecting how much larger the case had become than any one participant's individual role, bigger, in the attorney's own words to Arthur, than Arthur himself. John Walker pleaded guilty in federal court in Baltimore on October 28, 1985, to conspiracy to commit espionage. His plea agreement was structured in significant part around securing a reduced sentence for his son. He agreed to cooperate fully with investigators and to testify against Whitworth in exchange for leniency toward Michael. Prosecutors' sentencing memorandum later noted that Walker had failed repeated polygraph examinations concerning exactly when his brother Arthur's espionage activity had actually begun, suggesting the family's full history with Soviet intelligence may have been even more tangled than the guilty pleas alone reflected. On November 6, 1986, U.S. District Judge Alexander Harvey II sentenced John Walker to 2 life terms plus 10 additional years. In handing down the sentence, Judge Harvey told him plainly that his motive had been pure greed, and that he had been paid handsomely for what the judge called his traitorous acts. Walker and his son did not look at each other during the proceeding. Michael Walker, sentenced the same day as part of the plea arrangement his father had negotiated, received 25 years. His attorney, Frank Burstein, argued that Michael had suffered genuine remorse and that he had, in essence, looked to his father for the love and approval any son seeks, approval his father had instead used to lead him into treason. Jerry Whitworth, the last of the 4 men to face trial, chose to contest the charges rather than plead guilty. His trial began March 24, 1986 in San Francisco, with John Walker testifying against him as the government's key witness under the terms of Walker's own plea agreement. After a 4-month trial and 10 days of jury deliberation, Whitworth was convicted on July 24, 1986, on 12 of the 13 counts against him, the jury deadlocking on a single charge. On August 28, 1986, U.S. District Judge John Vukasin sentenced him to 365 years in prison and fined him $410,000, calling him, in the harshest terms the judge used that day, one of the most damaging spies of the century, by far the harshest individual sentence handed down in the case, reflecting both the scale of what prosecutors argued he had provided and his decision not to cooperate. The damage assessment that followed the arrests prepared jointly by Naval Intelligence and the FBI, concluded that the material Walker's network had provided over nearly 2 decades had compromised more than 1 million classified and top-secret naval messages. Then, Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger stated publicly that Walker's espionage had given Soviet military planners insight into American weapon systems, sensor capabilities, naval tactics, and training and readiness procedures across surface, submarine, and airborne forces. Rear Admiral William O. Studeman, then Director of Naval Intelligence, stated that no sentence any court could impose would be sufficient to answer for what he called the operation's unprecedented damage and treachery, and separately suggested it may have been among the most consequential intelligence operations the KGB ever ran against the United States. Some naval historians have gone further, suggesting that Soviet intelligence may have influenced North Korea's 1968 seizure of the USS Pueblo specifically to obtain American cipher machines that, combined with the keying material Walker was already providing, would allow the Soviets to read a substantial volume of encrypted Navy traffic. This theory remains a matter of historical debate rather than settled fact, but it reflects the scale investigators eventually attributed to what Walker had started with a single visit to an embassy in 1967. Financially, estimates of what Walker personally received over the life of the operation range from several $100,000 to as much as $1 million, a striking sum for the era, though one that several of the case's investigators would later note was almost certainly smaller than the damage the material caused, an imbalance common to espionage cases in which the value of stolen secrets rarely tracks neatly with what an asset is actually paid for them. The case also triggered lasting institutional reform. Then Secretary Weinberger ordered a roughly 10% reduction in the number of military and defense industry personnel, at the time numbering in the millions, by one estimate as many as 4.3 million people holding access to classified material, and the periodic reinvestigation process for personnel with continued access to cryptographic systems was substantially overhauled in the years that followed. The Walker case broke in what the press at the time had already begun calling the Year of the Spy. 1985 saw more arrests on espionage charges than any year since the end of the Second World War, including the case of Jonathan Pollard, a Navy intelligence analyst arrested that same year for passing classified material to Israel. Naval historians and intelligence officials who later compared the two cases generally judged the Walker material, because of its cryptographic nature, to represent the more severe loss to national security, even though Pollard was found to have handed over a far larger raw volume of documents. In the aftermath of both cases, the FBI, the Naval Investigative Service, and the National Security Agency conducted extensive independent reviews of how each operation had gone undetected for as long as it had. Michael Walker served approximately 15 years of his 25-year sentence and was released in 2000. Arthur Walker remained incarcerated until his death at the federal prison complex in Butner, North Carolina, in July 2014 at the age of 79. John Walker died less than a month after his brother on August 28, 2014, also at Butner, at the age of 77, reportedly of throat cancer, and less than 9 months short of the release date he would have reached under the sentencing rules in effect when he was originally sentenced. Robert Hunter, the FBI agent who had led Walker's arrest, gave an interview around the time of his death in which he said of the man he had spent years investigating that he believed him to be pure evil. Jerry Whitworth remained incarcerated at the federal penitentiary in Atwater, California, as of the reporting around Walker's 2014 death, then 75 years old, serving what amounted in practical terms to the remainder of his natural life under his 365-year sentence. Barbara Walker testified under a grant of immunity at Whitworth's 1986 trial. Speaking to reporters afterward, she said that of everyone touched by the case, her children had been hurt the most, and asked rhetorically whether any child wouldn't be hurt by discovering their father had been a spy. She also stated publicly that she would never have gone to the FBI at all had she known her son was involved, saying she loved Michael too much and that learning of his role in the operation had devastated her. Laura Walker Snyder gave a series of interviews in the months after the arrests, including to the Christian Broadcasting Network, in which she described her ex-husband's threat to expose her father's espionage during their custody dispute as a form of blackmail aimed at preventing her from regaining custody of their son. Her ex-husband denied making any such threat. Laura ultimately regained physical custody of Christopher in the midst of the unfolding case, a development she credited directly to the chain of events her November 1984 conversation with her mother had set in motion. The Walker case remains, decades later, one of the most frequently studied examples of family-based espionage in American history, not primarily because of the volume of material compromised, extraordinary as that volume was, but because of what it reveals about how ordinary bonds of trust can be systematically converted into instruments of betrayal. John Walker did not simply commit espionage. He recruited, over more than a decade, a brother facing financial hardship, a son barely out of his teens looking for his father's approval, and a lifelong friend, each of them drawn in not through ideology or blackmail, but through relationships that, in any other context, would have represented the ordinary architecture of family loyalty. The case does not resolve into a simple story of one villain and three victims. Arthur Walker, Michael Walker, and Jerry Whitworth each made an independent choice at some point to participate in an ongoing conspiracy against their own country, and the law treated each of those choices as carrying real and serious weight, as the sentences handed down in Baltimore, Norfolk, and San Francisco made clear. But the mechanism by which each of them arrived at that choice was different, and in at least Michael's case, was inseparable from a father's calculated use of his own son's need for connection. What is not in dispute is the human cost that extended in every direction from the operation John Walker began in 1967, a brother who died in the same federal prison where the operation's architect would die a month later, a son who spent his 20s and much of his 30s in prison, a marriage that ended in bitterness, and, according to Barbara Walker's own account, physical violence, a daughter caught between loyalty to her father and a custody battle that ultimately became the mechanism of his downfall, and an ex-wife who, by her own account, spent years unable to act on what she knew, and who said publicly, after it was finally over, that whatever else the case had done, it had hurt her children more than anyone. John Walker was 30 years old when he first walked into the Soviet embassy, carrying material he was not authorized to share. He was 77 when he died in a federal prison medical unit, having spent nearly as many years incarcerated as he had spent as an active Soviet asset. In between, over roughly 17 years of espionage and nearly 3 decades of imprisonment, he built and then destroyed something no sentence could restore, a family whose trust he spent deliberately, one member at a time, for reasons that even by his own account amounted to little more than money.